You are watching Germantown Municipal Television, your source for everything Germantown.
Hello and welcome to Law Talk on Germantown Municipal Television. My name is Vince Perryman. I'm a local attorney with the law offices of J. Vince Perryman. Each month, Law Talk focuses on a wide range of legal issues and topics. Today's show covers student loan modifications. With us now is attorney Bruce Ralston. Bruce, thanks for being with us. This is a big topic, and I think probably a place to start is just sort of how we got into where student loans are today.
It is a big topic. There's a lot going on in my world these days, and a lot of this is fairly new, but it does help, at least it helps me, to go back to the beginning. And in a way, the beginning of student loans as we know them today was the GI Bill of Rights from 1944. Still during World War II, Congress passed this Bill of Rights that was a follow-up on a horribly failed similar bill after World War I, which led to the Veterans March on Washington in 1932, which didn't end well for anybody. So they got a second chance, and they did it more or less right. So in the GI Bill of Rights, the GI Bill of 1944, there were provisions for unemployment compensation and for loans for housing and farms and small businesses and for education and training. And this went over remarkably well. Nobody had any inkling of how well this would do. By 1947, just a couple of years after the war, roughly 49% of all new college applicants were veterans coming through with the GI Bill. And then by 1956, when the original GI Bill expired, I believe the number is out of 16 million World War II veterans in America, 7.8, almost half of them, 7.8 million, had done some sort of education or training through the GI Bill. So Congress looks around and go, wait, not only are we doing good for our veterans, but we kept a massive influx of unskilled labor from washing into the job market all at once at the worst possible time in our economy. And now those people are not only coming out better, they're trained, and our economy is lifting as a whole. So what else can we do like this? So they came up with the Defense Education Act in the mid-1950s. And that was also, you'll remember the time of the Red Scare. I'm sure you don't remember. I don't either. I was just born about that time. But it was the Commie Menace, and they were thinking about how to deal with that. So they set up specific student loans for people who were getting training in engineering, science, and education. Again, went over very well. Fast forward to 1965. This is when the Higher Education Act was passed. And this is what we're still working under right now for the most part, is new iterations of the Higher Education Act. This was the broad student loan policy, student lending policy that applies generally to everybody for whatever course of study at whatever level. And most federal student loans that we're talking about right now are under the Higher Education Act. There are a few. There are HEAL loans, which are through the Department of Health, which are specifically for doctors, nurses, chiropractors, dentists. I don't see any of those. I don't know why, but I just don't. But most of what we're talking about is the Higher Education Act. And a lot has changed since then. Programs have come and gone. There are different applications. There's different situations. But let's fast forward to 2010. As of 2010, there were two forms of federal student loans. One is the direct loans, which is exactly what it says. The Department of Education lends money directly to students, sometimes to their parents. The other is guaranteed student loans, where the actual lender is a private lender, but the loan itself is guaranteed by the Department of Education. Okay. So effectively, in most ways, they're the same. But again, there are different types of loan, different applications, and different resolutions when a problem arises. So in 2010, Congress amended the Higher Education Act once again to eliminate the guaranteed loan program. Of course, there are still tens of millions of dollars of guaranteed student loans hanging out there, which we're still dealing with on a regular basis, but they are steadily dwindling away. So right now, all we have, the only federal student loans that we have now are direct loans, which to my mind is better. Some would disagree, really not relevant. to this conversation. So, and some interesting statistics. Roughly 20 million Americans attend college every year, and roughly 12 million of those take out some sort of student loans for that. That's a lot of people, a lot of money. Right now, as a recent estimate said that there is about 42 million Americans who are presently carrying somewhere in the ballpark of $1.3 trillion of student loan debt. That is more than credit card debt. That is more than car loans. It is second only to mortgage lending as far as consumer debt goes. So talking big numbers. If you do the basic math, 42 million divided into 1.3 trillion, you get about $30,000 per person. That's a lot of money. Yeah, I've been primarily a bankruptcy lawyer for the last 20 years. And 15, 20 years ago, it was really unusual to see somebody with a 5-figure student loan come in. Very unusual. Now, if we see somebody come in with a $20,000 student loan, we giggle and say, oh, how cute. You know, it's a little student loan. But $30,000, that's real money. But it's another way of looking at it is a car loan. You know, it's about as much as a car loan, plus you have 10 years to pay it off. So most people with a $30,000 student loan level won't be that bad off. And just sort of coincidentally, if you go through a 4-year college program and get all of the basic federal student loans, you will come out with roughly $30,000 of debt. So that's a total coincidence there. It has, one number has nothing to do with the other. But again, if you come out of college and you have any kind of decent loan, you should be able to pay off the student loan over 10 years. Wouldn't be that much trouble. But there are exceptions, of course. There are different situations, and that's what we see. There's all kinds of different situations with, well, let me go ahead and talk about some of the special situations. And so far I'm only talking about federal student loans, but there are also private student loans. When I said $1.3 trillion, that includes federal and private, but over 80% of that is federal student loans. There's still a couple $100,000 of private, a couple $100 million of private student loans out there. And that is a completely different conversations. There are different ways of dealing with those things. And there are actually very few similarities between the two. With federal student loans, we have many different programs, income-based repayment programs that allow people to manage things on their own. And as long as you don't have a lot of other debt, then you can pretty well be sure of getting into one of these income-driven programs and having a payment plan set up that you can actually live with. Private student loans, not so much. Let me do a little back and forth on federal and private. Federal student loans, they have all the leverage. They can attach your tax refund without saying boo. They can attach your wages with all they have to do is send you a letter and give you 30 days warning. They cannot automatically put liens on property, and they cannot automatically attach bank accounts, so there's something there. And most importantly, there is no statute of limitations on federal student loans. Private student loans, those of you who deal with any sort of debt issues or credit issues would compare them to a credit card. It's exactly the same thing as a credit card or a personal loan, with the single exception that it's very difficult to discharge a student loan in bankruptcy. Might have time to talk more about that later. But let's come back to
that's
that.
a perfect spot for our break. So when we return, we'll continue our discussion on student loan modifications. Please stay with us.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
Cinderella found the pet that fits her perfectly. Tiana gave her pet the royal treatment. Belle found beauty where no one else did. And you can too. Share your heart. Share your love. Bring home your forever friend. Make a shelter pet part of your world. Happily Ever After begins at theshelterpetproject.org.
you are watching Germantown Municipal Television, your source for everything Germantown.
Welcome back. I'm Vince Perryman, and you're watching Law Talk. Joining us on our show is attorney Bruce Ralston. We're discussing student loan modifications. Bruce, before the break, we were getting into all the different types of student loans and sort of the history of it. So it seems like this is just sort of one big quagmire mess that you sort of have to figure out. So how confusing is this to figure out where you are?
I use those two words a lot, quagmire and mess, because that's what it is. When somebody comes to me with a student loan issue, occasionally they have a pretty good handle on what their situation is. Most of the time, they either don't or they're very wrong about some important point. So that's my first step, is to unsnarl the mess. And because, as we talked about before, there are different loan programs and different time frames and different situations and different ways that the government has of collecting on these loans, or different levels of servicing, and it goes from the lender to a servicer to a debt collector, and they're all managed differently. And if you're in default, you handle it differently. So it's just a big old mess. It's a total cluster, and you have to peel away the layers. So that's the first step of my process. And once you learn all these different programs and methods and circumstances and apply them a few times, you get to the point where you can peel away the layers pretty quickly. And once you get it out in the open, once you know where you stand, then the clouds part and the sun shines and the angels sing, and very quickly I can usually tell you what your options are and how much your payments will be. And we'll get into more specifics in a few minutes as to how those payment options often play out. But yeah, getting through that first step can be a bear, especially if you have the situation where somebody has both federal loans and private loans. And because those are two completely different conversations, and they're both confusing, and you really have to segregate those two concepts. With the federal student loans, do you qualify for these programs? Have you tried to use one of these programs before? If so, does that disqualify you from doing this again, and therefore do you have to use this other program? Whereas with student loans, it's either pay or don't pay. I mean, it's almost that simple. I'm sorry, with private student loans, I'm not sure if I said private there. Again, let's come back to the private loans later, but it's a quagmire. So the first step is figuring out what you owe and to whom you owe it. And there's a process that we go through for that. There is a website, the Department of Education has a website, nslds.ed.gov. That's National Student Loan Data Service, .ed for the Department of Education, and .gov. And anybody can go there. Anybody who has a student loan can go there and create a password, a username and password for themselves, log in, and it's still confusing, but once you play around with it for a little bit, you can kind of at least figure out how many loans you have, what the status of those loans are, whether any of them have been consolidated, what the balance of those loans are. And if you have a federal student loan, there is a 99.9% chance that it's there. They're very good about this. There have been some hiccups, as with any system, but it's a pretty darn good system, and they maintain it pretty well. If you believe that you have a student loan and it's not there, then it's probably a private student loan. And again, completely separate conversation there. But again, once you figure that out, then you pretty well know where to start. The first point I'd like to jump into here is not really the best resolution. It's just the easiest conversation. Or if one of these circumstances applies to you, then you want to go here first rather than go through the more complicated consolidation and income-based repayment plan that I'm going to talk about later. But there are administrative discharges. If you are totally permanently disabled, and of course that's qualified in some ways, but it's really not that high of a standard. If you can get if Social Security says you're disabled and you're on a 5-year review plan on your Social Security, then you're disabled. Otherwise, get a letter from your doctor that says, I know this person, I've examined this person, he or she is disabled. Then you can pretty easily qualify for total permanent disability. There is a one-time review after 3 years just to make sure you really are still disabled, but if you can qualify, then poof, it's gone. The ultimate discharge is death, okay? So if you die, you die, and unlike many other kinds of debts, Student loans don't stick with you. So if I'm the student and I borrowed the money, and I die, then the loans are gone. The federal student loans are gone. They're not going to bother my heirs, my wife, my children, nobody else. It's just not going to be a problem. There are also things called Parent Plus loans, where parents of students can borrow the money on behalf of the students, but now only the parents are responsible. In that situation, if the student dies, regardless of whether they're still a student, if that person dies, the parent's off the hook. Small consolation, but it's the kind of thing that people worry about, and they're at least glad to know that they're not stuck with this. There are other specific situations. If the school closed within a certain time frame before you graduated, sometimes you don't have to pay. You can administratively be discharged. If there's a thing called false certification, there's some fun stories here. You used to be able to go to college even without a high school diploma. Not anymore. You've got to have a high school diploma, or at least a GED. And there are some perhaps less than reputable schools that will say, sure, you graduated high school, didn't you? Let's get you into our program. And then a few years later, they find out that your degree is worthless because you never graduated high school. In that situation, for the federal student loans, you can get it discharged administratively and fairly quickly and easily. Another situation is another good example of false certification is the truck driver or the man who is legally blind who went to truck driving school. He could never, ever get a job using that degree. Why they let him do it, who knows, but they shoved him through the system. But again, those things are fairly rare and don't often come into play. But when they do, they can be real neat tricks, good shortcuts. If you are in default on your student loans, bad things happen and can happen pretty quickly. As I already mentioned, the federal government can attach your tax refund. They can attach your wages. They can stick private debt collectors on you. The debt collectors who collect on the federal student loans are just private debt collectors like anybody else. So if you happen to do FDCPA work, this is a good rich resource for that, because they will make the same mistakes there that they do with other kinds of debts. They can offset Social Security, which can be a real kick in the head for people who only live off of their Social Security. And that can be a problem. But it's capped at 15% of the Social Security, and they have to leave the person with at least $750 a month. Partay.
Okay. Well, and that's a good spot for our break here. So when we return from our break, we'll talk more with Bruce Ralston about student loan modifications. Please stay with us.
They'll test you, try to break your will. But however loud the loudness gets, however many cheese puffs may fly, you're the driver, the one in control. Stand firm. Just wait. And move only when you hear the click that says they're buckled in for the drive. Never give up till they buckle up.
So who's gonna do what?
I'll pack the dead batteries.
Great.
I'll only put what I don't need into a duffel bag.
Perfect. That's totally unhelpful.
No problem.
Meanwhile, I will try to comfort everyone by speaking in a calm voice. And who is going to handle supplies?
I can forget to do a list for us.
Thanks, pal.
We couldn't be any less prepared. I'm proud of you guys.
Talk to your kids about who to call, where to meet, what to pack. Visit ready.gov/kids for tips and information.
You are watching Germantown Municipal Television, your source for everything Germantown.
Welcome back. With us now is Bruce Ralston. We are talking about student loan modifications. Bruce, before the break, you were talking about all the things that the government could do to you, and I think we ended with the garnishing on Social Security and all. I mean, so what else? Was there anything else that the government can do to you?
Yes and no. I mean, there are always other things, but that's the meat of it. And so now is where I get to say not all the news is bad and scary. There are some very nifty things we can do with federal student loans. And let me start out by saying this is not me being a super smart lawyer, even though I am. it's just federal programs. The Department of Education has set these things up, and there are guidelines for this. And as long as you can unsnarl that first mess and figure out which program to get into and how to apply it, then it can work very well. I talked to a young man a couple of weeks ago and working with him. His basic student loan payments per month were $783 a month. We're getting his payments down to $17 a month. It's just because it's based purely on income. Now, we are talking about a 25-year period instead of a 10-year period, but still $17 versus $783. He can live, he can eat, he can pay his utilities now.
Right.
That's the difference. Can you live with it? And my starting point when people ask me whether they should do one of these things is, my first question is, well, can you afford the payments now? If you can afford the payments now, A, you probably don't need the program, and B, you probably wouldn't qualify for any kind of benefit from it. But if you can't afford the payments, if it's causing you any hardship at all, then we should talk. So the good news is that there are ways out of this. If you're in default, with most of these federal programs, you can consolidate out of default as long as you have not previously consolidated everything. You can actually consolidate multiple times, but once it's all up into one ball of wax under the direct loan program, you're there, and that's all you can do. If consolidation is not an option, you can rehabilitate. Rehabilitation is basically you set up a new payment plan by which you have to pay 9 payments in a 10-month period, and once you've done that, then now the loan is rehabilitated, and that would that would take you out of default, and it would stop any wage garnishment and put you back in a program. Now, the really good news is that when you're doing the consolidation and the rehabilitation, at the same time, you are setting up an income-based plan. So when your payment was $783 a month, and I'm telling you, you could rehabilitate, and you're going, you mean I got to pay $783 a month for 9 months? No. You can pay the $17 a month for 9 months. You can set it up on that lower payment plan, and at the same time, it can still be tough if at the same time they're already garnishing your wages or there's something else bad going on. But there are ways through this. And again, there are different plans for different programs. Most of the time we're talking about IBR, income-based repayment. The umbrella concept is IDR, income-driven repayment. There's also ICR, which is income contingent, and there's a thing called ISR, income-sensitive repayment, which just doesn't apply anymore. For the most part, we're almost always talking about IBR, if at all possible. It's a better plan, it's more workable, it's broader, and it's a lower payment. About the only exception to that is people with Parent Plus loans. These are the parents who signed on for their children's loans, and sometimes you're talking a graduate program, sometimes you're talking more than one child, and sometimes you're talking well up into the 6 figures. And these are people who are already 50 or 60 years old, and no, they're not going to be paying for 25 years, but it's income based. So even if they're still working right now, even if they're making $100,000 a year right now, the payment is still going to be less than it is now, and they can still retire whenever the time comes for them to retire, and then boom, the payment goes back down to where it would be at that point as well. So it's a comfortable way to get your life back under control, and it's all perfectly legal, and it's just another program.
Yeah, I mean, and this is always an interesting thing because you always hear that, well, with student loans, you can't discharge them in bankruptcy, so, what can you do with them? And that's always something that's on Congress's plate, or, well, around here, Steve Cohen's always pushing for, let's let folks discharge it.
At least the private loans. There are some inroads there. They're both federal and private. It's a little bit easier to discharge private loans, but that's like saying it's a little bit easier to climb Mount McKinley than Mount Everest.
Well, and then, so how long does it take to get through all the paperwork on these things?
Typically, if you're going to, well, the rehabilitation is clearly, it's going to take you 9 months to do the process. The paperwork is really fairly quick. Once you know where you stand, we can fill out the forms in a half hour or maybe a little bit more. The consolidation process usually takes 2 to 3 months. But in the meantime, you're still usually just making the lower payment. Again, it depends on if you're in default already, if there's other circumstances, but usually you're talking 2 or 3 months to a few months to get yourself back in a position to have everything smooth again.
Yeah, so I guess when you're looking at this, what's sort of the ideal folks that should look at it? I mean, I guess really those that can't afford to pay the payment that they have right now.
You know who are some of my best clients right now?
Attorneys, I would guess.
Bingo.
Because they've got more debt than...
there are lawyers who, we were talking earlier about public service loan forgiveness. Now, this is another one of these specific programs. Lawyer comes out of law school with undergrad and law school debt of $100,000. And they go to work for the public defender's office, making okay money, but not okay enough to service that loan. They can get in one of these income-based plans to get their payment down to an affordable level, and then after 10 years instead of 25 years, the remainder of that is forgiven. As long as you're working for a registered nonprofit or a governmental entity, federal, state, local government. If your paycheck comes from them, then you qualify for public service loan forgiveness, and it can be a real blessing to people who are doing the work we want them to do.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's one of those things that I don't think that a lot of folks know about this. So, you know, that they have the ability to do this. Because I know when well, I guess that's been 10 years ago, but when I was in school, you know, there was always this talk of, well, there's going to be this public service forgiveness eventually. But, you know, I guess when it got done, there wasn't really any press on it to let folks know.
Right. It's still fairly new. It is confusing. There's some bad information out there. There are some companies who are touting, you know, such as Obama loan forgiveness, and they're charging way too much money for this, and they aren't giving people the right information. They're quite often putting them in a decent program, but they don't always tell them everything they need to know, and they aren't always giving them all the right options. They aren't always considering all the possibilities. So, you know, and I guess at a point of shameless self-promotion, I mean, I typically charge less than half of what those guys do, and I quite often do a lot more for people.
Yeah.
Because, you know,
Well, your advertising budget is less. You know, that's the whole thing. And, you know, you're promoting it as something to help you as opposed to let me scare you into doing something, which is always one of those. But that's a great place for us to wrap up. Our time is up for this edition of Law Talk. I'd like to thank our guest for taking time out of his busy schedule and being with us and sharing his thoughts and insights. If you'd like more information about Law Talk or any other program on Germantown Municipal Television, please refer to our website at www.gmtvonline.org. Thank you for joining us today, and be sure to join us next month for more discussion on legal topics. Until then, I'm Vince Perryman, and thank you for watching.